BlackRock is working with BRICS. BlackRock is working with Saudi Arabia. They're working with the UAE, and they're working to one degree or another with Russia and China. But their intermediaries with Russia and China are really the Gulf states. And as I say, their plan for the region is stability. And Syria is now going to be sort of a protectorate that is controlled by half a dozen regional hegemons. And that is going to be stabilized. Sharia is not important. He's not actually the leader. He's more of a governor. I don't like this portrayal of that they are Zionists. Where's the proof that they're Zionists? That they're being attacked?
How are they not Zionists? So Israel did everything. Why are they trying to seek normalization? You had Israel, who was cheering the downfall of Assad, who was facilitating weapons to the resistance, and now you have Israel that's occupying Syria, and the focus of Golani, as they're being invaded by Israel, is to kill Syrians instead of fighting the Israeli resistance.
You understand that
he did exactly what the West wanted to do. Because
you understand that the Israelis are the ones who are trying to incite the Druze.
Syria was already weakened by Western sanctions. So why would you have a revolution when your country is weakened and can't defend itself from the main enemy? And now the same people trying to seek normalization. What you're saying inherently doesn't make sense, sir. I'm sorry.
Okay, now you're mixing the topic with regards to the original revolution and what happened with the rise of Sharia in taking over the government.
And now U.S. going to occupy Syria. How is that a good thing? I sincerely don't understand how that.
Syria. You understand that Israel has been occupying in Syria for over 30 years.
Now they 100% okay with it, though. Now they're okay with it. Now they want to make deals with it with Syria. This is why.
Do you think that violence and war is better than negotiation?
Sorry?
Do you think that violence and war is better than negotiation? Is that preferable?
They engage in violence and war against their own people, the Golani regime. Instead of confronting, and this is my criticism. Instead of confronting the Zionist regime that is stealing their water, occupying their land, why will you be focusing on attacking and killing your own people? Why seeking normalization with the enemy? That's what I don't understand.
You don't understand the necessity of stabilizing your own government.
It's not stable. How is Syria stable right now?
Well, how is it not stable? Except by means of American and Israeli subversion through the Druze communities and the minority communities and the Shia.
That doesn't sound stable to me. That does not sound stable to me.
And it needs to be stabilized.
Syria is not being stabilized. It's been unstable because the CIA was propping up resistance groups that were designed to weaken the Syrian government so Israel can stroll in the same way they have. Is there something you disagree with that about?
As I said, you're talking about the initial civil war. That's something different than what we're talking about in 2025. The initial civil war had its own rationale, had its own motives, had its own its own context at that time. I disagreed with it at that time. I disagreed with it throughout the civil war. I don't disagree at all with the removal of Bashar al-Assad. And I don't disagree at all with the, excuse me?
It's not going great for the Syrian people. I don't understand when you have...
Where are you getting your information about the Syrian people's position? I'm getting it from Syrians.
Yeah, I'm getting it with Syrians who are upset that the Golani regime is not only they're failing to do anything about Israel, they're begging for normalization.
You're getting your information from pro-Bashar al-Assad factions within Syria, as opposed to the majority.
Sorry?
So you're getting your information from pro-Assad sources in Syria as opposed to the majority of the
They're not
citizens.
even pro-Assad. Like many of these people have criticism of Assad. It was just horrific strategic maneuvering by people who was misled by the West, which led to a weakened Syrian government, which allowed Israel to steamroll them. Right?
I don't see that they're being steamrolled. I see that Syria, as I said, has been more or less taken over by half a dozen countries whose overall plan is for stability in the region.
Okay. But with that said, I want to shift to our main topic. I want to bring in our guest today. We have amazing geopolitical analyst, investigative reporter, and political pundit as well. Thank you for joining us, host of Syrian Analysis, Kevork Almassian. I appreciate you for joining us on RBN once again.
Thank you so much, brother, for having me again.
Yeah, I would love to get your thoughts on some things I was just discussing. But most importantly, I want to get your thoughts on the developments in the Middle East that we are seeing. We are seeing the United States and the West completely normalize the brutal Golani government. But I want to get your perspective because we heard a different perspective from Shahid Bolsen, who puts back on me, which is fair. This is not an echo chamber. People can push back on me. That's 100% okay. And I'm down to always learn new stuff as well during the process. But I want to get your perspective because you're one of the sources that I've been following because Shahid questioned like the sources I get my information from. You're one of the many sources I get on Syria. So I want to get your perspective on the United States dropping sanctions on Syria and everything that led up to it. I appreciate your perspective and I thank you for joining us on RBN once again.
Thank you so much, brother. Actually, the sanctions against Syria is not new. The U.S. imposed the first batch of sanctions in 1979, quoting or claiming that Syria is a state sponsor of terrorism. And in this case, we have to identify what terrorism is according to the U.S., and that is the Palestinian and Lebanese armed factions which carried out an armed struggle against the Israeli occupation forces. And since Syria, under both presidents Hafez and Bashar, his son, have supplied these non-state actors with weapons, ammunition, training, and intelligence support, they were labeled as, let's say, state sponsor of terrorism, and the sanctions were imposed since then. But the acceleration of these sanctions started mainly after 2003 or during 2003 when the US occupied Iraq. And they sent the then Secretary of State, Colin Powell, to Damascus, who sat with Bashar Assad and told him that we are basically now the rulers of the Middle East after Iraq. And we want you to follow our dictates. And our dictates are to stop supporting the Palestinian and Lebanese armed factions against Israel, close their offices in Damascus, kick them out of the country, cut the strategic relationship with Hezbollah and Iran, and redirect your geopolitical posture basically from what was called the axis of resistance to the other side, and that is the axis of normalization of relations with Israel among the Arab countries, right? Or what they call the moderate Arab camp, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, etc. And back then, Bashar rejected these, let's say, the demands of the United States, and it took them probably quite a decade to oust him from power. And when Golani came, he basically implemented those demands that the US has been asking the former president of Syria, Bashar, and his father for over 40, 50 years. But he implemented them in 5 months, basically. So what he did, basically, he gave up the Golan Heights to Israel, and he gave up Mount Hermon, which is the highest hill in the region, which means that Israeli artillery now can fire on Damascus from 20 kilometers away from the capital of Syria, which means technically that Damascus has fallen in the hands of the Israelis. They don't need to invade it. They can control it from militarily and from their aerial superiority over the region. He arrested Palestinian leaders in Damascus. He detained them and he imprisoned them, and he closed their offices as well. And he sent a signal to Israel that they want to normalize ties with them. So he did everything in 5 months, right?
Yep.
And accordingly, the main reason why these sanctions were imposed on Syria and then accelerated into a regime change war, a covert operation by the CIA called Operation Timber Sycamore, was exactly to force or persuade Assad to do this shift, the U-turn in his foreign policy. So when Assad rejected it, they ousted him, they brought Golani, but this is a very important information that I would like to share with your respected audience. In October 10, 2024, the Jordanian foreign minister came to Damascus, Ayman Safadi, and he delivered a verbal message to Assad from the US and from Israel, telling him that after the assassination of Hezbollah's leader Nasrallah, things are going to be very bad for Hezbollah in Lebanon, and there is going to be a ceasefire agreement which is in favor of the Israelis. And they expect from him to be part of the ceasefire agreement by sealing the borders between Syria and Lebanon, which means cutting the supply chains of Hezbollah from Syria and from Iran and from other places to Lebanon. And the Jordanian side told Assad basically that this is your chance to do your U-turn because your main ally Nasrallah has been killed, and this is now your window of opportunity to do the shift on our side, because the axis of resistance is losing and you shouldn't stay on the like a sinking boat, right? And Assad rejected that offer. So the ceasefire agreement came in Lebanon, I believe, on the 10th of November 2024, and Netanyahu declared it. And 6 hours later, Golani attacked on Idlib, from Idlib to Aleppo, and he occupied it. So those are all like those sequences of events are all interconnected. If we separate them from each other, we will come into, in my opinion, a wrong conclusion about what happened in the country, and we will judge Golani based on his so-called, let's say, militaristic background. But the truth of the matter is there was a consensus among the US, Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Israel to oust Assad and bring Golani. But before they brought him to power, this was the agreement which was already being struck with Golani and his backers by Israel, because Israel would have never accepted Golani to occupy Damascus unless they knew prior that his handlers, basically the CIA, the Qataris, the Saudis, and the Turks, will force him to normalize ties with Israel because this is a confrontation that they don't want. In fact, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the rest of this so-called moderate Arab camp, they have been fighting with Israel against the Palestinian and Lebanese armed factions. So it was just a natural development or a natural thing to expect that these, let's say, friends of the United States would bring Golani to power, but with the condition that he would normalize ties with Israel, and something that he already did. Because if you follow the statements of Golani, the foreign minister, and the diplomatic statements of the Syrian foreign ministry, they all call Israel by its name. They say Israel. The previous and the former regime or government, they used to call the Zionist entity. So even in the language, in the Arabic word, when you say a Zionist entity, you are not giving or you're not recognizing the political legitimacy of the political system in Israel. Golani's government, they call Israel what it is, a state of Israel, which they already recognize Israel as a state.
Yeah, that's exactly why I called him a Muslim Zionist. And Shahid was confused when I mentioned that, but he supports and he wanted friendly relationships with Israel. And this is as Israel was still in seizing the water supplies of Syria. This is as Israel was invading their country. As Israel was invading their country and committing hostile actions against the state, you had Golani that was attacking and killing people he viewed to be loyal to Assad, the Alawites, and stoking the violence in the Syrian civil war. And they are repeating this narrative now. Seeing a lot of these headlines that are frustrating, like Trump is asking for Golani to normalize ties with Israel. That's bullshit, as you mentioned. Because look at it. Look at the date here. This is December 2024. Syria is not stable, and as Syria is unstable, the number one goal of Golani and his men was calling for cordial ties with Israel, even though Israel, as they say in the headline, was resistant. So Israel was engaging in aggressive actions against the Syrian state, while the Muslim Zionists and Golani and his entourage, they was begging Israel to stop attacking them and begging them to have a friendly relationship with them, essentially legitimizing the Zionist state. Here's just another headline. You can see many of these. Syria willing to normalize ties with Israel under right conditions. So to me, and this is why I speak to people like you, Kevork. I speak to many people like Shahid. I speak to many people in the Middle East because I'm trying to get their perspective as an American. I will never pretend I'm like a Syrian expert from Syria. But to me, just using common sense, it seems counter-revolutionary to try to have peace and stability while teaming up with the CIA and with the Zionist entity who is cheering for the downfall of Assad. So as someone who's not Syrian, I can't say Assad was a good leader or a good person. But I want to pose this question to you because I see a lot of people who say they resist the Zionist state, but cheer the downfall of Assad. Are they in the right? Was Assad useful to the Palestinian resistance? Why are many people who claim to oppose Zionism also cheer am I missing something? What are they correct in cheering the downfall of Assad? Was he a useful figure in the Palestinian resistance? I would love to hear your perspective.
If you can take off this article, brother, I will screen the statement today of Caroline Levitt. Caroline Levitt is the press secretary, and this is the post that she mentioned here. So what are the demands of President Trump to Golani? This is the first demand, like sign onto the Abraham Accords with Israel. Like they're not even hiding. This is the first. Like it's not even any interest related to the United States, you know, like allowing us some business investments in your country. No, this comes the first. Join the Abraham Accords, which means normalize ties with Israel. Tell all foreign terrorists to leave Syria. So those are the multinational terrorists who came to Syria with thousands of them to join the fight against who? Against Assad, right? And now they're fighting alongside Golani, basically. The third condition is deport Palestinian terrorists. So basically, the Palestinian terrorists are the ones that the Americans consider them terrorists who carry out an armed struggle against the Israeli occupation forces. And already Golani has done these things, right? He already normalized diplomatically with Israel. He even sent a delegation, according to Haaretz, to Israel. And this delegation stayed there for around 5 days, negotiating with Israeli security officials about the future of the coordination and cooperation between the both sides. Now, under the former government, this is important to mention. We have to give some historical context for the people to understand what are we talking about, because this regime in Syria, it came after a coup. But Syria, before that, it lived 9 coups. So there were 9 coups, and the last coup was carried out by Hafez al-Assad, who established a system, basically in the country, a socialist system which was functional for the people, and people were started receiving free education, free healthcare. The infrastructure has been improved in the rural areas. He focused on agriculture and manufacturing, etc., etc. Now, Hafez al-Assad attacked Israel in 1973 in cooperation with partnership with Egypt under Anwar Sadat, because they wanted to liberate the territories that Israel has occupied in the 1967 war. Now, once the war was over, Syria liberated only a small part of its territories. Egypt, however, after the end of the war, they have decided to take a different path. And they said, we no longer want to fight against Israel. We'll pursue a diplomatic approach. And they have asked the Americans to come and mediate. So Egyptians signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1978, the Camp David Accords. And since then, Syria lost its partner in the region in this struggle against against Israel. And Syria is a smaller country with smaller resources and a smaller economy, which in 1973, when they partnered with the Egyptians, they couldn't defeat Israel because the Americans were there and they were supporting them unconditionally against these Arabic countries, right? Therefore, Syria knows its limitations, so they didn't open an open front and war against Israel since then. But Syria, since it is in an anti-Israeli position, they have waged a different type of warfare against Israel, and that is the unconventional indirect war against them. And that's when the Syrians started supporting the Palestinian armed factions in Palestine, in Lebanon, and supplying them with arms and training to carry out this fight. So now, I'm not going to give my opinion. I'm going to say what, for example, the former leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, said about Syria when the war started in the country in 2011. He said, guys, especially talking to the Palestinians, where did you get all these missiles and anti-tank rockets? Where did you get the Cornet rockets that you're blowing up the Israeli tanks? Where did you get your rockets? Where did you get your missiles? Where did you get the knowledge? And he said, those are all either through Syria or from Syria. So if you fight against Syria and you destroy Syria, the Syrian army and this current regime, or the former regime, then you are doing a disservice to Palestine. What you're doing is you're helping the Israelis in this case, right? So this was his logic. That's why he came to Syria to fight against these terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, because he saw Syria as a cornerstone of this axis of resistance against Israel. And he said, if Syria is gone, rest assured that Palestine will be gone. And we in Lebanon will be gone, because we will no longer have a geopolitical access to the east. We will no longer have the supply chains, and we will no longer have the spare parts and the supplies that we receive in order to manufacture, to repair, and to carry on this, let's say, struggle against Israel. So if you're going to install, let's say, a puppet government in Damascus, then who is going to give us these materials or these means to continue the fight against Israel? And he was correct. Since Syria is gone, Hezbollah was forced to localize itself. Now Israel is bombing Lebanon and assassinating Hezbollah people. They are even destroying civilian neighborhoods, but Hezbollah is not retaliating against Israel, because they know the price of retaliation and an open war against Israel, again, without supply chains and access to Iran, to Iraq, to Syria, is suicidal mission. So basically what happened is Hezbollah has been localized. Now they're no longer able to open a big front against Israel. And their, let's say, allies in the Gaza Strip, they also lost their supply chains from Hezbollah, because Hezbollah used to get these weapons from Syria and smuggle them into Palestine. And now, since this is gone, the Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others who are carrying out this struggle against Israel are completely isolated as well. And this is the question now that I raise, because my criticism also is for these Palestinian factions, especially Hamas. I mean, logically, how is it possible for Hamas to celebrate the regime change in Damascus? Are you? But this is the thing, like because you mentioned Bolsen, right? This is the thing with the Middle East. Sectarianism plays a huge role. And because Assad was an Alawite, because Hezbollah is a Shia group, they will always look at these groups from a different angle. They will never consider them as part of the Islamic Ummah. They will always see them as apostates, as someone who deviated from the true Islam. And this explains 50,000 civilians in the Gaza Strip got killed, right? And 2/3 of them are women and children. And despite that, have you seen all these so-called mujahideen going and fighting for the Palestinians? No. Nobody went to Palestine and carry out a jihad there. But when it comes to Assad, because he was an Alawite, because in their eyes, the Alawites are apostates, That's why they sent tens of thousands of multinational terrorists from all around the world, and they managed to send them to Syria to fight against Assad, but not against Israel. So sectarianism plays a huge role, and there are people, in my opinion, in the region, those who support Palestine on one hand, but on the other hand, they do a big disservice to the Palestinians. I think they have helped Israel immensely, and I think that the Israelis are laughing now in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem for the insanity and the stupidity of some of these journalists, experts, also inside Palestine. Like, there are people living the bombardment inside the Gaza Strip by Israel, and they're celebrating Golani. This is Stockholm Syndrome. And I believe that were it not for the propaganda and the brainwashing by the Qatari outlets, by the Saudi outlets, which is on the same level of absurdity of any mainstream media outlet, the way they manipulate the people, brainwash them, they have managed to create a generation, basically, which is completely ignorant of the root cause of the conflict in the region. And they are hyper-focused on these vertical divisions in the Islamic world, Sunni, Shia, Alawite, and they're fighting among each other. Meanwhile, the empire is expanding, basically, in the region. That's why in my today's stream on Syriana Analysis was Trump's Middle East, America won. And I'm someone who is not going to come and make compliments or try to persuade the people and tell them things that they like to hear. My job is to tell them the bitter truth. We in Syria, we stood against this insurgency because we wanted to keep our country sovereign economically, sovereign politically, and sovereign militarily. Syria has lost all its sovereignty completely. Now, these multinational corporations are going to come to invest. Syrians will own nothing, and they will be happy. That's the logo of the next stage in Syria. At the same time, Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris will help this government in the Golani government to stay in power for as long as they can, because they see that Golani is Qaeda and his army are Al-Qaeda, and no one can at least control to the minimum level these very chaotic terrorists in Syria but Golani. So they see that Golani is needed at the current moment. But this comes with a package of normalization of relations with Israel and abandoning the Palestinians, etc. And after October 7, when we see the outcome of this war, I personally see, I'm talking about the Palestinians now, not the armed factions or those who are carrying out the fight. Palestinians didn't win this war. They have been destroyed, they have been humiliated, they have been killed every day in the most gruesome way possible. And I mean, we cannot watch any longer this footage coming from Gaza, right? So if anyone is living there, if I was living there, I will be desperate, I will be defeated, my soul would be defeated, and I would like to leave the enclave of Gaza, right? The same goes to Lebanon. They have completely penetrated with technology and intelligence the leadership of Hezbollah and decapitated entire military and political leadership of Hezbollah. Then they did the regime change in Syria. So they isolated Hezbollah and the rest of the Palestinian factions. They have won in Syria completely. So my opinion is the axis of pro-Israel in the region or pro-US, they have now the upper hand in the region. That is why the Saudis and the Emiratis have joined these forces, let's say, of the US in the region, and not the BRICS, for example, because in their eyes, they still see the US as the dominant power, as the strongest power, and the power which is able to dictate and impose realities or new realities in the region, unlike Russia and China. So the thing with Russia and China, so we're on a free podcast, so we can criticize everything and everyone. So the question is, from 2018 onwards, the former Trump administration, 1.0, he stopped the regime change, the covert operation in Syria, but he imposed sanctions on the country. So between 2018 and 2024, how many Chinese and Russian companies came to Syria and invested in the economy to support the Syrian economy so that the Syrian army would continue fighting? How many times the Russian or the Iranian or the Chinese came to repair all these damages to the Syrian economy? They haven't done these things because on one hand, they couldn't do it. On the other hand, they were so reluctant and they didn't see so much benefits for them. But Syria was part of a multipolar world, which has given them an access to the Mediterranean, has given access to the Chinese for the Silk Road initiative to be extended to the Mediterranean shores, for example, and has given the Iranians access to the entire region, and for the Russians also to have a foothold on the Mediterranean. So they needed to have this, they have this interest in Syria anyways. But the Syrians didn't receive enough economic backing from their allies. And internally, so Syria before the war was self-sufficient. Syria had an industrial base, which means it can produce anything and everything, including assembling cars. I was in Paris in 2010. I bought an Adidas t-shirt from there. It was written "Made in Syria" in the back. Syria used to export products all around the world, was self-sufficient. Its foreign debt was zero. Its GDP was increasing 4.5% in 2010. 7 million tourists in 2010 in Syria. Syria had wheat, Syria had oil, and Syria had cotton. Syria had everything. They don't need anyone, so they had a sovereign national economy. And that's why when the war started, the Erdogan sent his mercenaries, they dismantled all these industrial zones, and they took the factories to Turkey because they wanted to kill the economic sovereignty of Syria. And then the Israelis and the Americans killed the political and military sovereignty of Syria. So Syria is completely gone. There is no Syria. Syria is not a sovereign country. It is controlled by other powers. So these celebrations.
So Syria is not stable. You say you're telling me that Syria is not indeed stable. That's how some people classify it. It's very sad because it seems like the fall of Syria was such a disaster for the resistance because the amazing breakdown that you did, and the Western sanctions just hollowing out the country. And that's one of the reasons why, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one of the reasons why Assad and his government wasn't able to put that resistance up the way it did, was because of the long-term effects of these sanctions. And that's why, as someone who was looking at the anti-Zionist movement as a whole, when people would accuse me of being a Assadist, I'm like, I'm not governed by the Assad. I'm like, what Assad is doing has nothing to do with my analysis. And I've been asking people, and I've been discussing this with people like you for years. That's why I'm extremely confused, and that's why I was taken aback when I see people that cheer the current result of what happened with all these foreign forces taking out the Assad government, because Assad had every reason to sell out his people based on what you laid out. He could have easily taken the deal by the West. What did Assad get by supporting the resistance? It seemed like there was a massive gamble for him that didn't pay off. So when people was cheering the downfall, to me, once again, not as a Syrian, but someone just looking at the chessboard, it seemed like it was a horrible thing to cheer that on. But I think you wanted to chime in. Kevork, anything else you want to add? I want to ask you to give you a question to focus on, because I want to ask you about the new Syrian government. The headlines I've seen from the West just cleaning up Al-Shura. That's, I guess, what they call him now. I know him as Golani. They call him Al-Shura now.
I will call him Golani.
Yeah, that's why I know him. I guess he changed his name. I don't know the fucking story behind that. I guess he changed his name once he became a leader. But I know him as Golani. I'm gonna keep calling him Golani because this fucking terrorist guy. This is one headline. This is like the best you're gonna find. Yeah. Syrian leader Shara's path from global jihad to meeting Trump. And there's so many of these headlines I've seen that make me barf out. People saying how he's matured. He went through a young, rebellious, pro-terrorism phase. So I just want to ask you about his politics in general, because I won't pretend I know that much about local politics, but it seemed like he was engaging in a brutal crackdown of the Alawites, people who was his political enemies. So for the people who believe that it was worth crafting the deal with the United States, selling out and giving away a Golan Heights to Israel and the United States, how will you counter? How will you say what? How will you define his local politics? How he governed the country? Are you optimistic about the future of Syria? Let me ask you the question that way. Anything you want to add before?
So first of all, Golani came after a coup. He didn't come to power via military victory. There is a big difference between an insurgency which fights against a regime or a government and they win the war and then they come to power. In his case, the Syrian army has laid out its arms, and there was a coup inside the military to lay down the arms and allow him to come to power. And once he came to power, he appointed himself as the president of the country without elections. Okay, probably because he has a revolutionary legitimacy, right? Because he was the one who was carrying this fight. But then he postponed the elections for 4 years. And during this time, he proposed the draft constitution, which gives him the authorities of a king. Like, he is not responsible in front of any authority in the country. He's not responsible in front of the parliament or the cabinet or the judiciary, which means he has absolute powers, more than what Assad used to have. At least Assad was responsible for his actions in front of the parliament, and the parliament had the authority to isolate the president. But this guy is not responsible for anyone and anything. So
and you notice that none of those people are calling for elections in Syria, by the way, guys. You notice that all those people who was calling for elections when Assad, no, they all quiet now. But please continue, Kevork. Very great points.
Yeah, so he's basically, selected himself as the Tsar, as the king of Syria, without any elections, without asking the opinion of the people, and the constitution gives him absolute authorities, right? And at the same time, he's basically, once you bring someone with an Al-Qaeda background to power, he's going to polarize the Syrian society. So I truly believe that they wanted him to come to power to do exactly this, to polarize the Syrian society. Now imagine you are part of the 30-40% of the minorities in the country, and then you bring someone who is not even a member of the majority of the Sunnis in Syria. No, he's part of a minority inside this Sunni community which believes in the Al-Qaeda ideology. And all of a sudden you are faced with someone who doesn't believe in a civil governance, doesn't believe in a constitution. This is according to him. Like, for 14 years, he was preaching against democratic governance, against elections, against constitution, against man-written laws. He was saying, giving statements, speeches after speeches, that it is against the rule of God to have elections and to have constitution, and we have to only implement the Sharia laws because this is God's word, right? This was him, and also him was saying that all these Gulf countries, he mentioned them, that they are puppets for the US, and they pay taxes or money to the Americans to keep them in power. And he says, like, they have to carry armed struggle against this type of governments in the region. And he said also that after the liberation of Damascus, he will go as a liberator to Jerusalem. Like, he said a lot of things, but he just did exactly the opposite, 180 degrees. And when he came, he said he's the president of all Syrians. But then when the massacres happened in Latakia, Tartus, in the coastal cities, basically killing thousands of Alawite civilians, unarmed civilians, he didn't hold any responsibility or accountability. And he said he will form a delegation and they will investigate themselves. Just like Israel drops a bomb on a tent, like a ton of bomb on a tent, and then they say, oops, we will investigate ourselves. But nothing will happen. So he already polarized the society to the extent that the people who do not believe in his governance, in his ideology, do not want to be part of this country any longer. So if Balkanization was a goal of the US, Israel in Syria, then Golani has materialized that already in the country, that the people do not want to be part of such a state, you know? So the Alawites, the Druze, the Kurds, the Ismailis, the Yazidis, Christians, Armenians, everybody is saying we don't want this type of governance. But are they able to express themselves publicly? Like we say in Syria, you have the freedom to say to express your mind, but we don't guarantee what happens to you after you express your opinion, right? Yeah, you're free to say what you like, but then what happens to you when you express your opinion? And the detention centers, the prisons are all full now in Syria. So what is the difference between Assad, who they said that he imprisoned his political opponents and he killed his political opponents, and then he was fighting against his own people, right? Although his own people were like tens of thousands of multinational insurgents and clearly from all around the world. So what is the difference between Assad and this guy? If Assad was not democratic, Golani is not democratic. Exactly. If Assad has killed his own people, Golani also killed his own people. So what is the main difference? The main difference is Golani wants to give up the Golan Heights. He wants to normalize ties with Israel, and Assad doesn't want to do that. That's the only reason. If Assad did a U-turn 3 weeks before he fell, he would have saved himself and saved the country, but he would have become also he would have bowed to the Israelis and to the Americans and accepted their conditions, right? But because he didn't do that, they took him out of power. So this has nothing to do with democracy, human rights, governance, etc. It is all about geopolitics. And that is why when the press secretary of Donald Trump, he typed this post on X, they don't even say anything about democratic rule or governance or protecting the minorities, nothing. They just say, Abraham Accords, this is the first one. So this is enough indication to know what type of leadership is Golani's leadership is. I think your categorization of him as a Muslim Zionist is accurate. And I think that he was a CIA asset for a long time. And this is not my words. This is the words of the former special envoy of the U.S. to Syria, James Jeffrey, who said in 2021 to PBS that Golani's army has been an asset for the U.S. strategy in Syria. So those are all public statements made by a strategy. I'm checking the article because I want to show to the people what I'm saying is basically. This is basically mentioned by officials in the U.S. Administration, and before him, Jake Sullivan in 2012, when he sent an email to Hillary Clinton, basically telling her, quote, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, and Al-Qaeda, the leader of Al-Qaeda was Golani, right? So this is the article that I am going to refer to now, just for the people to know what we're talking about. So this is coming from PBS, basically. So PBS in 2021, this is James Jeffrey. He served as U.S. ambassador under both Republican and Democrat administrations, and most recently as a special representative for Syria engagement and special envoy to the global coalition to defeat ISIS during the Trump administration, told Smith that Golani's organization was an asset to America's strategy in Syria. I mean, so is this a revolutionary organization, or it's a regressive organization in your opinion? Look, I'm genuinely now, I believe that the US won, and fighting against the US now with military means is suicidal mission, because you don't have a superpower giving you any support to carry out any sort of struggle against the US. And we have seen what's happened for the people who resisted in Palestine, and we don't want for our countries to be completely wiped out. So having good relationship with the US, I'm not against it. But let's be honest. Let's not sell a cause to the people and bring thousands of people from all around the world to Syria to carry out a jihad in our country and destroy our country, our sovereignty, our economy, our lives, basically, because we're humans and we also have lives and memories and future to worry about. And after everything, you come and say, oops, everything I said in the past, forget about it. Now I want to be not only friends with the US, we want to be allies with the US and also normalize ties with Israel. This is hypocrisy, peak hypocrisy. So being honest with your intentions, and then doing all the ridiculous things like wearing a keffiyeh and showing solidarity in big stadiums. Yeah, look at me with the Palestinian flag, but then normalize ties with Israel. It doesn't. These two things cannot really match, Because look, if you want to open ties with Israel, at least have the honor and the dignity to delay it a little bit until this Gaza tragedy is over, or at least the Palestinians forget about what happened to them, at least in a year, 2, 3, 4, I don't know. But in the middle of the onslaught against the Palestinians, you're arresting the Palestinian leaders in Damascus, you're closing their offices, and you're saying, I want to normalize that. So you're rewarding Israel for what it did to the Palestinians. That's the thing, you know? I'm not saying even don't do it, but at least have the courtesy to do it a little bit later, just to, you know, pretend that you tried and you didn't abandon the Palestinians. But this is so ugly in the face of the people. And now all these Palestinians who celebrated, they're like, oh my God, I'm shocked. I'm like, sorry, but we warned you.
It was the most predictable thing ever. And I appreciate your breakdown. Your breakdown was amazing. That was a glorious rant, very educational. Because I understand that the Syrian issue is slightly harder to understand than the Israel-Palestine issue. I explained many times before, the Israel-Palestine issue, super easy to understand. Once you scrape past the surface level of Western Zionist propaganda, they convince you that Israel-Palestine is about a religious struggle, that the jihadists wanted to kill the Jews. Once you get past that, it's really, it's an issue of settler colonialism. No, it's an issue of genocide. It's an issue of apartheid. Israel-Palestine, very easy to understand. I will admit, though, that Syria is a little bit more complicated, and that's why a lot of people get tricked. Because
I have a tip. My friend.
Go ahead, Kevork. What was that?
You know what's the tip? In any conflict, if you don't understand any conflict, there's so many conflicts that I don't understand. But if the portrayal of the conflict is, if you put the lens of democracy versus tyranny, values, and we are protecting our freedoms in Iraq, and we have to oust Gaddafi because he's killing his own people, and similarly to about Assad, etc. Those are all bullocks. If you don't analyze any conflict in the region and abroad from geopolitical lens and financial lens, you're already misanalyzing the situation.
Well said.
So my judgment of Assad, right? I was Syrian. I have the right to have an opinion about my president or former president. And I always said my main consideration, my most direct reason why I stood with the Syrian army against these insurgents, because I wanted to preserve the sovereignty of my country and its will to have a sovereign economy and sovereign political decision, and not to be part of this globalized world, which is like nobody has clear lines where the sovereignty is, and everything is interconnected because of the financial and technological interconnectivity among each other. And I'm not saying Syria shouldn't be part of the world. What I'm saying is Syria should keep the minimum level of its sovereign decision making, and especially when it comes to its production. If you can't feed your own people with your own agricultural sector, if you can't feed them bread and meat and eggs from your own, you're already dependent. This is some just basic things. If any country cannot feed its people, this country cannot survive without outside support. When the outside world cuts the supply chain, you die. And the same thing goes with other things, right? So this is why we supported the Syrian army, and this was the main reason. And we knew that the alternative is going to be exactly the opposite. They're going to open the markets now for everyone to come. They will invest in the country. You will have nice buildings. You will have this what do they say, scrappers or whatever, these tall, big buildings, Trump Tower, because this is what also Golani says, he will build the Trump Tower in Damascus. Yeah, but can the people afford to go to the Trump Tower and drink a coffee? That is going to be...
The austerity is going to be wild. That's a great point. The austerity is going to be wild.
That's the thing, that people really get caught in the hype of these ridiculous things. the development is not with long buildings. Development means, if a country is developed, means this country can produce. If you cannot produce, you cannot be developed. If you're dependent on the development of the outside forces, you will always be under the rug, under the control of these powers. Maybe I'm just being now too on the left, because some people were calling me right wing the other day. But this is the logic, right? This is the logic. Yeah, this is the logic, in my opinion. So I think Syria lost everything now, and they will have nice banks, and they will be part of the SWIFT again. They will gain more money, but everything will be more expensive because they will not be the producers, and the production that they're making for other companies will fill the pockets of these corporations, and they will receive this small breads, cups of breads. So that's why I said, when Assad fell on, this was December 8, 2024, on the 11th of December, 3 days after Assad fell, I was on RT International. I said two things. I said, I want to make bold prediction. Between 3 to 5 years, I said, this new regime will normalize ties with Israel, and you will see the Israeli flag flying over Damascus. My however, prediction seems to be wrong, because he will probably do it in 1 year, not in 3 years or in 5 years. He's so in a hurry to do it, you know. And the second thing I said, the Syrian people will own nothing and they will be happy. And this is what Golani did. He gave all the oil fields now to the US companies. He gave the Mediterranean port in Latakia to France. Israel has taken over entire south of Damascus. Golani cannot even send soldiers now, because Israel has created the demilitarized zone 60 kilometers in depth inside Syrian territories, occupies the highest hill, which controls Damascus. And now all these corporations, and you will see soon Starlink and everybody will invest in the country, but Syrians will own nothing from this. He offered all the minerals of the country, like Zelensky, to Trump. So they are sucking the country dry. And this is what makes me sad, to see the people celebrating and selling it as a victory. In 1948, when the Arabs lost the war against Israel, they called it the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. And then in 1967, when they lost the war against Israel, they called it the Naksa, which means the setback. And now they called the another defeat against Israel a victory. Like every terminology has become upside down. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that was another great rant, and I love where you knew exactly where I was going with that, because as I was mentioning before, the Syrian, for people who are new to geopolitics, I think the Israel-Palestine issue is very easy to understand once you get past the surface area. There's so much BS, especially with Al Jazeera. I've seen a lot of people call them out. There's a lot of nonsense in the pro-Palestinian space. There was so much like people falling for Western talking points. And as I was navigating this issue at first, I came at it as an anti-imperialist. Since I'm American, I see the CIA siding with the people that wants to overthrow Assad and their government. I've seen the imperialist sellouts in the diaspora that was cheering on for sanctions in Syria in order to weaken the Assad regime. Meanwhile, people like you who are not fans of Golani, and I've seen many people as well that said they are happy that the Syrian sanctions were lifted, even though they are upset that Golani is ruling. Meanwhile, I'm looking at this issue. I am seeing the people who was against Assad, because we will make an argument like, hey, man, why can't we lift the sanctions on Assad? No, we need the sanctions to get rid of Assad. So I knew that these people didn't have the best interest of Syria at heart. That's why we are not surprised to see Syria kowtow to the Zionist lobby. I saw the West, for example, another trick that you can use if you're ever confused about an issue. If you see the BBC and if you see the Washington Post and you see the neoliberal corporate media obviously cheering for one side, you should at least ask yourself why that is. So I saw the Western media was jubilant. I've never seen neocons in the Western media as cited as when Assad fell. So that's another guideline, by the way. If you guys not sure where to land on the issue, wherever side the neocons are cheering for, at least be hesitant to take their side. So look at this headline. This is one of many you will see. How Syrian jihadist leader to rebel politician, how Mohammed al-Golani reinvented himself. So these are like, I can find a billion for you guys, at least headlines of them cleaning this guy up. But it was clear that the West was cheering for him, and it was 100% clear to me that there was a reason why. And now seeing him appease Israel in the United States, not shocking to me. But it was a great foreign policy power hour, as I've been calling these. Thank you for coming on here and clearing the